I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so we have a wide range of topics for you this week. We're going to kick it off. I'm going to talk about Trump's Asia tour, the potential implications for U.S. Long-term foreign policy and geopolitics. Then Will is going to take us back to New York to talk about Zohran Mamdani's fake aunt, his fake auntie story about 9/11. Then we're going to move to Ben. We're to talk about the Maduro cartel and the threats. Then finally, we're going to finish it up with Amber talking about the hysteria over Trump renovating the East Wing and putting in a ballroom that's just going wild on the internet. So with that, I guess I'll hand it to myself. Trump is right now on an incredibly important foreign tour of Asia. It seems like for many different administrations, we have been hearing about the pivot to Asia. And obviously, China does take center stage in the framing of the U.S. towards the entire region and the potential Cold War with China or potential hostilities with China as a powerful adversary that the U.S. has not faced, let's say, since the end of the Cold War. So that's all framing. Of course, there are also all of these trade negotiations that are going on. And in anticipation of Trump meeting with Xi in South Korea, we had Secretary Bessent also announcing that a framework has been struck for a trade deal with China, that the details are still going to be negotiated by the principals, but it's ahead of the deadline. It was supposed to be announced by November 1st, or there was going to be 100% tariff put in place against Chinese products in the United States and retaliatory withholding of rare earth minerals from China. So that seems to have been diverted or averted, that catastrophe in terms of global trade. So looks like there's a good framework. Trump right now, he just went through Malaysia where he did a classic Trump dance on the tarmac with cheering fans in Malaysia, but also presided over a peace deal, the final touches to a peace deal, signing of a peace deal between Cambodia and Thailand, which had wartime hostilities between the two of them. So another Trump peacemaking victory. Before turning to Japan, which is where he is as we're recording this. Japan has a new prime minister that is pretty cool, honestly. She seems to take Margaret Thatcher as her inspiration. There's been some great videos of her on the internet, but Prime Minister Takaichi, I'm very bad at pronouncing foreign names. I probably will count against me in the racist games. Anyway, so it looks like it's an extremely warm reception for Trump. The new prime minister is a sort of protege of Abe, of Shinzo Abe, famously really got along with Trump very well. Some beautiful gifts were presented to him. There's hats that say Japan is back, black baseball caps. Obviously, they watched the World Series together, which has I guess the Dodgers have some players that are Japanese on it. So it was a fun little moment between the two countries. This is actually all incredibly important because if the U.S. is going to be involved in a kind of soft Cold War with China, then the most important allies for us in the world are not all the usual players in Europe and not anything having to do with the Middle East. The most important relationships the U.S. has for its own interests in the world are with Japan and South Korea and other Asian partners. And so far, that appears to be going very well, including deals for some of those rare earth minerals that China can currently hold over the United States' head. So far, so good. Next stop is South Korea, which has a much more hostile leadership there and prime minister, somebody on the left. But ultimately, then Trump will be meeting there with President Xi. He may detour to North Korea to talk to the little rocket man. We're not sure, but a lot of pieces seem to be falling into place. This, honestly, to me, I'm curious what you all think, looks like a real Asia pivot, a tour of strengthening alliances that China cannot be very pleased with in terms of the tight relationship apparently between Japan and the United States. Hopefully we'll see a good relationship between South Korea and the United States, which is critical for our ability to actually grow our Navy and to build ships. So a lot of really important stuff that's getting pushed out of the headlines by all the stuff that we're going to talk about next, which is maybe more fun and getting more play on X. But what do you guys think about this Asia tour?
I'm glad that we decided to do this topic first because I think you're right that this has been really drastically undercovered by most of the media and is really important. I mean, in addition to this framework for the China deal, there have been announcements on trade deals with Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, all of which involve a significant reduction of tariffs on US exports in exchange for US lowering its tariffs, removal of non-tariff trade barriers, as well as access to rare earth minerals. So obviously really big moves on the economic front. I would also just wanted to point out what one of the gifts that the Japanese gave to Trump was because it was really quite beautiful. It was a putter that was used by Prime Minister Abe and was also signed by Hideki Matsuyama, who is a PGA Tour player who won the Masters tournament like 5 or 6 years back and was just really thoughtful. And, we see a lot of these gifts between world leaders. Some of them are tacky, some are just, expensive for the sake of being expensive. But this was one that obviously meant a lot to Trump, who himself is a really great golfer and um, was very close with Abe. And so it was really, really nice watching the World Series together. Shohei Ohtani of the Dodgers, who is Japanese, is arguably the best player in baseball right now. Some people think he's already on track to be a Hall of Fame player. So, yeah, I think both economically, symbolically, and then on this peace deal, there's been a lot of really amazing progress from this trip. And I think it's easy sometimes for the press to sort of say, well, like Trump's out of sight, out of mind when he goes on these world tours. It's sort of a break for them. But in this case, this trip, this Asia tour, has led to some really important developments for the American people and deserves to get that attention.
It's probably also worth noting, just politically here, that you have Trump once again dominating the world stage and continuing to vigorously pursue the agenda. And then you have Congress, on the other hand, doing nothing essentially, and the federal government shut down as a consequence of Democrat intransigence. So it's a significant split screen there politically and on the merits as well. I would underscore, I thought it was notable that the administration and the Japanese side announced this framework for, I'll quote from it, securing the supply of critical minerals and rare earths through mining and processing. To me, this is a direct signal to China that the US is going to continue to carve out agreements with like-minded partners to neutralize China's efforts to monopolize all of the Earth's most strategically significant resources and tools. And so you definitely see this competition continuing to play out on multiple levels in economic and military buildup, in diplomacy, in securing our own hemisphere, which I'll talk about a bit later. And all of this is sort of relevant to the US and aligned powers versus China and its sort of axis, and this continuing competition that's playing itself out in a whole variety of venues, of spheres. And you could say that it already is a new Cold War in some ways, but the decoupling continues apace. And I do think that there have been pretty tremendous strides taken, including maybe surprisingly even among US companies who were previously China aligned, that they seem to be getting the picture now, that a China-dominated world is not going to be in their best interest. And so you've seen even corporations like I saw JP Morgan is dedicating tens of billions of dollars towards securing our supply chains, seeking to invest in companies that are basically decoupled from China. So these are very big developments, and we're going to have to measure them over the course of many years. But this Trump trip is certainly squarely in the wheelhouse of this broader intensified competition. And then, of course, we'll see. President Trump has said that he believes there will be some kind of deal with Xi in the offing. We'll see what the parameters of that are and what areas they touch upon.
Yeah, I think this is a remarkably successful trip. Obviously, I really was. I thought, again, like you guys have pointed out, the gifts that the Japanese gave to Trump were really incredible. I mean, Abe's putter is just what a great thought. Like Trump being a golfer and a close friend of Abe. And for that gift to be given, it's really remarkable. And I think, I'm very excited about what, Japan is. I want Japan to stay Japanese. I think Japan's one of the coolest countries in the world. It's a totally unique place, totally different than everywhere else. And I think that they have a leader who's really going to push that direction. And I mean, Trump, like everywhere else, he's doing such a great job through his, kind of he's just such a naturally strong leader that he's doing a great job of cementing our alliances all over the world. And those alliances in Asia matter. They matter a lot. Like, Southeast Asia, Japan, these matter in terms of containing China. They matter in terms of maintaining our broader strength. So I'm glad he's doing what it takes to preserve those alliances.
And with that, I guess we'll move back home to New York City and to the mayoral race, which early voting has begun, and real voting, the final day of voting, will be on Tuesday.
So yeah, two big stories I think about Mamdani in the past week. One that just broke this morning. There was he finally decided that apparently this was now the time to start talking about Islamophobia, maybe because everybody, including myself, is calling to denaturalize and deport him. But last week he had a press conference where he talked about how terrible it was that after 9/11, his aunt felt like she couldn't ride on the subway because she was getting dirty looks. Now, the obvious, this is like really harkens back to that old Norm Macdonald tweet about how, the worst thing about 9/11 was how people would treat peaceful Muslims in the aftermath, not the actual deaths. But the story gets even better because it's not clear at all that Mamdani only apparently has one aunt, and that aunt wasn't in New York at the time. And so now he's saying, well, it was a distant cousin who's now deceased. Okay, really? Are you sure about that? Maybe are you certain you're not making up stories to try and play on people's fear, create a victim narrative, portraying yourself as the victim of Islamophobia? And then this morning, we have a new viral video come out that shows Mamdani talking in September 2023, just a little bit before the October 7th attacks, where there's always the classic leftist babble about grounding yourself in resistance when talking about Palestine. But in particular, he said something fascinating that, that we need people to understand that when the boot of the NYPD is on your neck, the IDF is lacing up the boots. And to me, it's like, can you combine in a single sentence? You've managed to combine this incredibly forceful and absurd anti-police position with an anti-Israel position, and suggesting that Israel itself is responsible for the flaws of the NYPD, which is itself kind of insane. I think Haviv Rediger, who I actually like a lot, a sophisticated Israeli columnist, pointed out that is exactly how anti-Semitism generally functions. You find a way to blame things on Jews that have absolutely nothing to do with Jews. So, yeah, Mamdani revealing himself yet again as this just incredibly noxious candidate. We have this sort of interesting debate of what's driving this. Is it like Islamist values? But I think the central thing, he's just a race communist at the end of the day. And we see all this polling that the polling shows that native-born New Yorkers would vote Cuomo, and only 8% of native-born New Yorkers would vote Mamdani. The reason he has a commanding lead is that he's winning 62% of foreign-born New Yorkers, and I think he's just a walking billboard. The guy is for immigration restriction. We had the whole early 2000s thesis about Islamophobia was that people were irrationally scared of terrorist attacks, which I don't think was true, obviously, but let's just go with that. But what we're seeing now is that the real threat of sort of mass immigration, especially Muslim immigration, is just they'll flex their political power to elect people who will destroy your country, who will, turn your city upside down, tax everybody into oblivion, to hand your money to migrants, and maybe if you don't want that, if you want to preserve your country, you need to actually say no to these people at the border where it's easiest to say no.
Yeah, I mean, just the entire framing on 9/11, of course, deeply offensive, and remarkable in a city that obviously still has. I've been surprised in some ways by how strong still the memories of 9/11 are here, considering how in DC I think they've really faded, and some of the other places. I mean, every September 11th here, everybody puts out American flags. All of the dive bars put out American flags. Like, it's very still palpable here, even so many years later. And the fact that Mamdani took a picture with the unindicted co-conspirator of the 93 World Trade Center bombing, and it didn't even become a political issue. There wasn't a single question at the debate for him from the media or his fellow candidates about the fact that he took that picture. There's just basically nothing there's no real attacks on him for that. It just seems like something that people don't want to touch, even when running against him, which I think is remarkable. But he's completely rewriting the history of what happened after 9/11 in this country. Frankly, after an attack of that magnitude, you would expect a lot of hostility and sometimes, unfair reprisals, right? And it really didn't happen at any kind of scale. In fact, the opposite happened. American views in every political category, American favorability of their American Muslim neighbors went up after 9/11, not down, it went up. George W. Bush bent over backwards. I think he visited a mosque shortly thereafter. He bent over backwards to separate. That's why he came up with this totally stupid phrase, global war on terror, a tactic, right? Because he was afraid to connect the attack to the actual ideology, which was Islamism, right? He wouldn't even say those words because he didn't want American Muslims to feel like they were responsible for this attack or had to or were being, unfairly stigmatized in the United States. And as Matt Walsh pointed out on Twitter, we still strip search grandmothers at the airport, even though, white grandmas have a 0% chance of being, right, or not, maybe not zero. There have been some strange incidents in the world, I suppose, but very close to zero chance of being a terrorist, because we don't want to, quote unquote, racially profile, Arab Muslim men. So America has bent over backwards not to attribute the 9/11 attacks and not to Islam in general, in some ways that I think were actually, so open-minded as to obscure the truth of the matter. So, I mean, I've always found this incredibly insulting. Americans did not turn, knife in hand on their Muslim neighbors, on people wearing hijabs on the subway after 9/11, and it's remarkable that they didn't. So that's the first piece of this, obnoxious video of Mamdani. In terms of his campaign in New York, there's just 2 points I want to make. One, I agree with Will, about the stopping at the border. By the way, another thing that happened after 9/11 is that Muslim immigration went up in the United States. New York is now has almost a million Muslim residents. It's almost 10% Muslim. It's only slightly smaller than the Jewish population in New York. And New York is identified as like the most Jewish city in America, right? So the Muslim population is not that much smaller at this point. They're almost equivalent. What we're seeing with Mamdani, I think, is that horseshoe. I agree again with Will. I don't think he's an Islamist. If anything, I think he wears his quote unquote religion as just another sort of intersectional trump card. He's brown and he's Muslim, and like they stack on top of each other in the intersectional game. I don't think he's a very religious practitioner of Islam. So I don't think of him as Islamist, but there is no doubt that a large part of his success is the fact that New York has let in a lot of radical Muslims, and because the country has let in a huge number of Muslims from Arab countries, from North African countries that have no intention of assimilating to American values, and no intention of becoming part of the religious tolerance that exists in America. So I do think that that's a major driver of his campaign, even though I think he himself is more in the mold of an academic anti-colonialist like his father. And I've said that before. And then finally, there's this meme, again, in terms of interpreting Mamdani. There's this meme that he was running a wholly economic campaign, that his whole campaign was about affordability. And it's true for the last 3 or 4 weeks. He's answered every single question, bleeding a line about affordability. Like he literally won't answer, what did you eat for breakfast yesterday without saying something about affordability. He's obviously leaning into his most popular message. But it is an absurd lie that he was like a post-woke candidate, that he shows that Democrats can run on economics and win. I mean, one of the guy's major campaign promises in the primary was to spend $65 million of taxpayer money on sex change surgery. Okay, he is not a post-woke candidate. His stuff about defunding the police are cultural issues, right? He put identity front and center in his campaign. He talks the entire woke intersectional language every time he talks, except for the last few weeks where he just can't, he literally hasn't said anything except the affordability, because he's running a campaign and he knows what the most, popular message that he has in an expensive city is talking about affordability. But there's this entire meme, sometimes on the right too, the populist right, who want to see something in common with the populist left, and in terms of long-term issues that I agree deserve attention, like the lack of affordable housing for a lot of young people and young families. That's a real issue. But Mamdani didn't shy away from cultural issues. He put them front and center in his campaign. It's just a rewriting of history for people's convenient theories about politics. And yeah, unfortunately, he's going to be the next mayor, almost certainly.
I totally agree. This is not horseshoe theory. This guy is dyed-in-the-wool cultural progressive. It's amazing that he literally did the Norm Macdonald meme of, what terrifies me is if ISIS were to detonate a nuclear device and kill 50 million Americans, imagine the backlash against peaceful Muslims. Like, he actually did that in real life. And the response has been sort of like, oh, yeah, well, no big deal. I think that it's also not a coincidence that these comments from Mamdani and the increasing focus on his quote unquote Muslim identity has been happening at the same time as this debate with Mehdi Hasan and conservatives that we talked about last week on the show regarding like what constitutes being American, who's more American than somebody else. Is it just for immigrants to the United States to try to export their cultural values to the US? Like, it just seems a little too convenient that all of this conversation is happening really in the same week.
Just on the Islamophobia point, this is not leveled as a charge on the merits. This is about shutting up anyone who would of Mamdani on any number of views. It's sort of like a tick. It's a natural response that he and others have when they get criticized to basically imply that any criticism has to be rooted in bigotry rather than on the merits or the substance. As far as I've seen, he's injected his Muslim identity into the race more than his opponents have. That includes in one of the debates when he said to Andrew Cuomo, like, what mosques have you gone to? So he's the one who is using his Islamic identity as a sword and shield to prevent himself from taking criticism and frame his opponents as immoral and bigoted. And the reality is that while we can have a very interesting academic conversation about are his views more derived from and do they originate from his leftism or from 12er Shia Islam, the bottom line is that the views are horrible. The views are terrible, and they're going to wreck Manhattan, and they'll serve as a symbol to the country for what electing people like the Mamdanis of the world look like. But nevertheless, New Yorkers are going to have to deal with the consequences. And I continue to believe that while this may be beneficial in the short run for Republicans to hold him up as the national representative, the personification of what Democrats are, future and present, I do think that he is the future in terms of the kind of candidate that he is in terms of his politics and then in terms of the ideology. And that's a very scary thing that the party representing half the country is going to be led by people just like him. So very disturbing. Last point, also just a brief one is, interestingly, when we talk about the immigrant part of this whole thing, the immigration aspect, he is the elite of all the elites. I mean, he is the definition of radical chic when you look at his education, his background, the kind of work that his parents do, Columbia professor, and a famed documentarian and movie producer. So he doesn't really represent at all the average existence of the immigrant voters who are disproportionately supporting him. And I think that's interesting as well. I mean, in some ways, he's tried to frame himself as like the exotic sort of figure in this race. But in reality, he's just another elite American who comes from a non-American background and bashes the country and tries to tear down its fundamental values and principles.
Yeah, and he didn't bother to get citizenship until like 2 years before he ran for office. So that's right in the same vein. Ben, back to you.
Yeah, so turning to a little bit more in our abroad, but near abroad, our hemisphere, and we talked weeks back about the building Don Roe doctrine, which we sort of loosely, I think, described as, or defined as securing our interests in our hemisphere and neutralizing the influence of our adversaries. And you'll recall that I think Secretary Rubio's first trip was really to nations in our own hemisphere. And when you look at that trip and you look at a lot of the administration's policies, it looks like we're trying to dull and neutralize primarily China's influence in our hemisphere. Related to that, and not just China, but also its allies and partners, including the likes of the Iranians and beneath the Iranian umbrella, Hezbollah, there's been a number of strikes on drug boats, as we've talked about before, in the Caribbean, and particularly targeting Venezuela's narco terror operations led by Maduro. We also, in recent weeks, saw the sanctioning of Colombia's leader as well for his the nation's basically drug trafficking and associated narco activities. So there's been a massing of U.S. military assets in the Caribbean. There were recent reports suggesting that the Trump administration, I think President Trump himself confirmed this, had authorized the CIA to take covert action within Venezuela. And now there are reportedly threats for land strikes on the cartels in Venezuela. This amid a $50 million reward on Maduro's head for him being turned into the FBI and increasing pressure, it seems like potentially to topple him after the U.S. ended diplomatic contact with that regime. So there are a couple interesting things to note here. I mean, one is the MAGA position going to be pushing for regime change in Venezuela of some form? Clearly, there's substantial pressure on that regime, which would seem to push towards an end of ultimately Maduro no longer being in power. But how that's effectuated is an open question at this point. Also, I think it's worth thinking about Venezuela more broadly. This has been sort of the heart of our adversaries' footholds in our hemisphere. And that includes relations with the likes of Russia. That includes relationships with China. And as I noted, that includes massive Hezbollah operations there pertaining to drugs and otherwise in our hemisphere. If this kind of fulcrum, this linchpin of our adversaries' operations in our hemisphere does at some point become friendly, that would obviously be a massive win for the U.S. for interests. I think that you see part of this is the pressure on Colombia as well. It's about sort of putting these nations to a choice. Are you aligned with us or are you aligned with our adversaries? Something not touched really by prior administrations, as many of these countries have gone in a wrong direction from the perspective of our interests. And then also it's worth noting, I think you can connect the building Don Road doctrine to the support for Argentina and the Milei-led government. So obviously there was what's been sort of characterized as a $40 billion bailout, or maybe a bridge loan or bridge financing, you could say, to steady financial markets with respect to Argentina in the run-up to these midterm elections there. And we saw that this, in fact, did seem to have the intended benefits for the U.S. and for Milei, our ally, with his party, I think securing over 40% of the vote. I think a plurality there. And this election was seen as a validator, a vindicator of the pseudo-libertarian sort of policies that have been put in place there. So we bolstered an ally that is essential to helping make the hemisphere more friendly for America, more beneficial for our interests, and to crowd out our adversaries here. And I see that as sort of the overarching kind of policy at play here. But I put it out to the group. What do you make of the intensification of the military operations against Venezuela's cartels? Do you think that regime change is in the offing? And how do you square that, if it is, with sort of the restraint that's inherent to the MAGA agenda of speak loudly, carry a big stick, but we only want to use overwhelming force generally in very narrow circumstances, and we're going to be very careful and prudent and circumspect when it comes to potentially engaging in something that could lead to the toppling of a regime. So what do you make of these developments?
Yeah, I think think it's good that we're finally doing something in Venezuela. There was a very interesting article, I think, by Jack Goldsmith. He published on his Substack, talking about how there's now essentially a golden shield that everybody in the administration has. That there's already been an OLC opinion allowing these, the strikes against Venezuelan drug dealers. And I think that, sort of there's this very strong push in the administration to deal with Venezuela in a very harsh way, given how hostile they've been to the United States. And I think this is, again, part of peace through strength, right? Like we're not as Trump said in that one statement, we're not declaring war. We're just going to kill we're just going to kill the people trying to bring drugs into our country. And so I don't think Trump is really interested in doing a full bore regime change war, but what we've demonstrated is we don't recognize the government as the legitimate government of Venezuela. We're going to kill your drug traffickers if they come into our country, and things are just going to be really bad for you until you've changed your tune. And I think that's the sort of America First attitude. Like, we don't have to be responsible for building up a whole new government in Venezuela. We just need to, but we can still treat the Maduro regime with the disrespect that it deserves.
Yeah, I mean, during the first admin, obviously Trump was backing Guaido, and that didn't end too great for him. Ended up basically strolling through a American airport after having effectively a bounty placed on his head in his home country. But hopefully that gives Trump some wariness about a full-blown regime change war, which could potentially empower the cartels even more. Because if Maduro is acting as some sort of quasi-stabilizing force, while obviously being at least partially co-opted by the cartels, there's always the possibility that if you take out the Maduro regime, that the cartel is able to explode and really wrest control during that process, which would be, I think, a primary concern of the Trump administration. And also, obviously, the MAGA America First base would not be thrilled with even the optics of getting involved in regime change. So if that's something that he wants to see happen, he has to be very careful about how involved the U.S. gets, particularly militarily. And I think this sort of external pressure campaign of trying to weaken Maduro through these cartel strikes is probably a safer option.
Yeah, one interesting thing is that nobody that I've heard has given any alternative for the domestic problem that Trump is trying to deal with here, right? Which is the inflow of drugs across the border. Nobody has given any alternative other than reduced demand that I've heard. Now, I do believe there are things we can do to reduce demand in the United States. First among them, you go back to actually arresting drug addicts on the street, so they have a choice between jail and rehab. But that I think there is this sort of hopelessness to any alternative to these strikes. For example, a couple weeks ago on the boat bringing drugs, right? We have the right to stop the drugs coming across our border. And in exercising that right in our own hemisphere, as our hegemon of our own hemisphere, I think Trump is on very solid ground. Now, I agree with what Amber said about, the question is always what's the alternative, and is it any better, right? Having a totally unstable country also benefits cartels, as we've seen just on our closer southern border in Mexico, right? If you don't have a strong central government, the cartels are the government. That being said, there's literally at least a dozen reasons why perfectly legitimate domestic and foreign policy reasons for us to be very heavy-handed against these cartels. They're funding our geopolitical enemies. They're hostile to the United States. They cause unrelated or like sort of cascading crime across our southern border, and they are increasing what is a health crisis in the United States, an addiction crisis in the United States, by not only by making drugs available, but by making them cheap, cutting them with fentanyl, and now I guess the thing is xylane, or however you pronounce it. It's even a new trank-like cut with these drugs that make people more addicted and more likely to overdose, right? So on every level, there's all kinds of reasons for Trump to do this, but I agree with Amber's caution about, unfortunately, we're not gonna like remake Venezuela unless the Venezuelans themselves want to undertake that. I don't think the U.S. from afar can probably prop up a regime. Although I will put this note on it. we can prop up a regime if we're willing to do it the old-fashioned way, and without any kind of sentimentality about democracy, right? We've had relationships with American-friendly dictators for, for 150 years. But that I don't know that there's the stomach anymore to do, just like Britain lost its empire, to do real empire building and just to have like a lackey in charge, an authoritarian lackey in charge of countries that bother us in the Southern Hemisphere. So bearing that in mind, I don't think democracy building in Venezuela is probably something the MAGA base wants to engage in. With that, we're going to go to our final topic of the, at least before final thoughts of the week, and going back to Amber to talk about the freak out over the East Wing.
Yes, which somehow manages to still be making headlines weeks after Trump started the construction of the new ballroom at the White House, which I believe we discussed at the time, but is obviously a good idea. We are hosting foreign dignitaries, world leaders in tents on the South Lawn, which themselves are, extremely expensive. Anyone who's ever planned a wedding knows that if at one point you got the bright idea that you were going to save money by finding some like public park and you're going to put a tent up on it instead of actually renting a venue hall, that you found out very quickly that that was actually not much cheaper, if not more expensive, to put up the tent with all the lights and the air conditioning and the fans and everything, and putting down the floor. It's not cheap. And they were doing this effectively every time that the White House hosted a state dinner or some other major event, because there is just not a large enough space in the White House to host hundreds of people. The East Room is not big enough. There's really nowhere else in the White House that works. So Trump decides he's going to build this ballroom. And he had actually talked about this as long as a decade ago, said that he actually offered to privately fund a ballroom for Barack Obama if he wanted to build it. Barack Obama never got back to him. So here he is in his second term, and he's like, fine, I'm just going to do it myself. And he's got backing from all these major companies who are contributing money to this. So this is at zero cost to the taxpayer. The architect who is doing it is someone with exceptional taste, James McCreary. A lot of people in the conservative movement probably know him. You might have been to one of his St. Patty's Day parties. Lovely guy, beautiful office. So I think that bodes well. He has a particular eye for sort of classical architecture to help it blend in with the traditional elements of the White House. But the freak out mostly came from the fact that Trump was originally planning on only getting rid of the facade of the East Wing, and then building this additional annex that would lead to the ballroom. But apparently within the process of getting rid of the facade, they discovered that the East Wing was really in quite bad shape. And so they opted to demolish it completely. They're going to rebuild some elements of it, as well as the ballroom attached. And everyone on the left who loved to tear down statues, had no problem firebombing police buildings or state capitol buildings or what have you, suddenly decided that they were the arbiters of historic preservation and that the 1942 East Wing needed to be saved, and that Trump was only flexing his authoritarian dictatorial muscles by getting rid of this building, which was probably created, let's be honest, to keep first ladies out of the way of the president. There's nothing really of significant or note in the East Wing. There's a smattering of offices for the First Lady and a theater. This is not the, central White House building. A lot of people were posting photos of the East Room and claiming that this was what was being torn down. The East Room is in the White House. It is separate from the East Wing, which is its own annex. And so all of this sort of revisionist history was being done by the left. There was also claims that he didn't have the authority to do this, like he needed to go through some central bureaucratic planning commission, etc. Just all kinds of craziness. I'm kind of curious on what y'all think in terms of why this has been the issue that has really become so salient for leftist imaginations. It doesn't seem like something that would really resonate with the general public unless they're betting on the idea that people are just going to get confused and think Trump is just tearing down the entire White House. I saw Neera Tanden, who is the president of Center for American Progress and, of course, was a top aide during the Biden administration, urging Democrats to run on Trump demolishing the East Wing as like their central issue in the midterms. And I was like, yes, great, please do that. I think that would be excellent for Republicans because it's so silly. Um, but I'll go ahead and open it up to the group for thoughts on the latest on the ballroom progress and the reaction from Trump's adversaries.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to talk about how incredibly silly this is without engaging in at least a little bit of pop psychologizing. And on that score, I think Mark Hemingway had the best take, which is I think they're reacting this way because once Trump builds this ballroom, it'll probably be the Trump ballroom or whatever, but it'll be associated in history with President Trump, and they can't handle the idea of something permanent in the White House being associated with President Trump. I think it's literally that level of weird psychology going on because logically there is no reason why this should be a topic of conversation beyond, a mean tweet of if you don't like the design that's proposed or something like that, or think it's tacky or that's the order of this. It's not unusual to renovate or change aspects of the White House. Many presidents have done so. There was really one very funny thing the administration did. They put a timeline of the White House and some of the changes that have been made to the White House and some of the events that have happened in the White House. And the first, whatever it is, 5 slides are okay. So the British burned it down in 1812, and then it was rebuilt and so on. And as you keep scrolling, then it says, oh, and then Obama let who was it? I don't even remember. It was like some ignoble visitor that Obama let in to the White House, and then Biden, Hunter Biden stashed his cocaine in the East Wing or something like that. It devolves very quickly in the last few slides into poking the Democrats and past Democratic presidents. But yeah, there's no reason to freak out about this. And truly, I think the only way to understand the level and persistence of the freak out, we're now talking about this, almost a week later, is through what Mark said about they just can't tolerate the fact that there might be a permanent ballroom that everyone knows that Trump built and that future presidents might hold state dinners there, which by the way was completely necessary. It's embarrassing that we were doing state dinners under tents.
Yeah, that's a good. Or sorry, did I beat you to it?
Go ahead, Will.
All right. Yeah, I'll be brief. It's crazy, as Inez just said, that we were doing state dinners under tents. The idea, and we needed a ballroom. There needs to be a place where the president can hold a major event, a state dinner. And it should be secure. It should be not accessible to the outdoors. It should have full presidential security. You don't have to look hard to look at Trump's buildings and realize that he builds beautiful ballrooms and that it's a nice thing that we be able to impress foreign dignitaries, that we be able to impress those who come to the United States. There's the left's, getting upset about this is just so bizarre. And the fact that they've doubled down on this insane lie about what Caroline Leavitt was saying, because she was asked a question about what renovations he was planning or were there other renovations he was focused on, and in that context the ballroom is his main priority. I think we'll be very glad to have had this ballroom built for many years to come. I think it'll be something for Americans to be proud of. It's privately funded. There aren't taxpayer dollars going to it. Crazy that it's become this big issue, and it shows how little the Democrats have to work with right now.
Yeah, that last point might be the most important point. The fact that you have Democrats enraged about this just tells you how rudderless they are right now. They're just grasping at straws. I've thought about run the mental exercise. What if the reverse happened? What if private donors had put up millions of dollars to build a ballroom and then Trump rejected it? Would the long knives be out for Trump from the Democrats then? How could you possibly reject this? Would it save the taxpayers money, et cetera, et cetera? They have to get angry at everything he does or does not do. And I think to boot in this case, it is just worth emphasizing the point. This isn't a frivolous expenditure of non-tax dollars. This is actually for a pretty basic function that the president as head of state has to do, which is hosting foreign dignitaries. This isn't a bowling alley or a pool or a basketball court or a movie theater or anything else. This is actually for a primary function of his job as a commander in chief, as the head of state. So I think it does certainly reflect that the left has just lost its mind and they have to engage in this performative outrage over everything. And of course, the talking points clearly went out because all of the pundits on the left had the exact same talking points about this from the jump. They're really rudderless right now. And I think the trolling from the White House was just the cherry on top with that photo carousel of the history of the building.
And with that, we'll move to final thoughts. And in lieu of the standoff, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and go first here. It's interesting that the shutdown didn't even make our top 4 topics, including the ballroom. It continues. I think, well, 2 things to say. One, I think that kind of being able to ignore it, we are going to come to the end because some of these things are really going to run out of money and they're going to start affecting people's lives. So we're already going to have flight delays and cancellations because of air traffic control. And SNAP benefits on November 1st, as of now, are not going to go out. The Trump administration has done everything they can to kind of finagle the money and move money around. But this is going to start affecting more people than just government employees and government connected jobs after this long of a shutdown. And it has been a very long shutdown. It's just on that point, it's fascinating to me that it has dropped so much out of the news. And it goes to show that I think there's a difference in strategy between the Democratic Party and their PR wing, the media, because the media is not covering this, I think, because they know that it's bad for Democrats. So when you compare it to the coverage of past shutdowns, one, you have Republican and White House not doing performative things like shutting down the Lincoln Memorial. And 2, the Democrats, clearly the media does not feel that it will benefit Democrats to talk about what is happening, to talk about the shutdown, to find those personal interest stories of people who are affected by the shutdown. They just haven't been doing a lot of that coverage. It's been very, very muted. And consequently, outside of DC, I can tell you in New York, it's not a topic of conversation. People are not talking about it. It's just totally dropped out of the news. So there might be a lesson somewhere in there about the size of government. Nevertheless, I think we are coming to a head with that shutdown. And I expect in this upcoming next few days that there will be some movement. Hopefully it won't be our side that breaks, but there will be some movement on this because the Democrats have, I think at this point, voted 13 times against a clean CR. So yeah, I mean, the standoff continues for now, and it's about to hit the rest of America in a more substantive way than it has for the past weeks.
Yes, and Democratic Congresswoman Catherine Clark, I believe it was, admitted that Democrats apparently want people to suffer so that they can blame the Republicans. But my final thoughts are on Sean Duffy pulling another $160 million in federal funding from California in the wake of several high-profile accidents involving illegal alien truckers. The most latest was on October 21st, so a week ago, where an individual who was driving under the influence killed 3 people in an accident in California. Sean Duffy had released a guidance back in September following other tragic accidents, including that illegal U-turn made by an illegal alien trucker, that states that were issuing CDLs to illegal aliens through the non-domiciled CDL program needed to not only stop issuing them, but also revoke the CDLs from illegal aliens who had received them prior. California failed to do that, and now there are 3 more people dead because they have refused to follow Sean Duffy's guidance. So the $160 million is, it's something. It's not, in the grand scheme of things, a significant amount of money. But it shows that Duffy is taking this issue seriously. The American Truckers Association has been very vocal about this issue as well. This is not just a matter of American jobs anymore, but American lives. And it's something that requires a very severe response, very severe consequences for states that refuse to follow the rules.
Yeah. My final thought is there's a report that just came out today. The House Oversight Committee issued its report on the Biden use of the auto pen in the latter days of his presidency. I haven't had time to parse through it totally, but I'm really interested in it because they have a full discussion of some transcribes interviews they did with Jeff Zients, who was chief of staff in Biden when all this craziness was going on. So I want to dig into it more, but I think there's going to be some new material here that we didn't have, for example, in the Jake Tapper book that we should probably want to do. And I mean, it still really is an incredible scandal. Some of the early findings I found was that it's not clear that Biden was aware at all of the criminal history of some of the many death penalty defendants that he pardoned. And you just have to go through a brief list of some of the horrific conduct that some of these people engaged in. If you have to wonder if Biden was actually in his right mind, whether he would have been willing to give any clemency to these people.
My final thought is on the developing counter left-wing domestic terrorism policy of the Trump administration and some additional Republicans taking notice of it. Today, there's a Senate Judiciary, I believe, subcommittee hearing chaired by Senator Eric Schmidt, who I was pleased to testify before earlier this year as well, on domestic left-wing political violence. Looking forward to seeing what that testimony looks like. And how the laws that are currently on the books can be pursued vigorously to prosecute and disrupt and dismantle networks of left-wing terror underneath, I think, maybe the most significant but overlooked policy of the Trump administration, which is its national security memorandum, which charges the Justice Department, Treasury Department, and beyond with taking out these networks. This is part of ultimately securing law and order on our streets. And it's a justified version of what the left tried to do and bastardize our laws when they framed conservatives as being somehow domestic terrorists and then abused and weaponized their powers against us. This has a chance to be the just and righteous way to go about pursuing people who are actually threatening the life and limb of our fellow Americans. So hugely significant policy, and glad to see that there's a congressional focus on it as well.
And that does it for this week. So on behalf of Will, Ben, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.